Hey guys, this is Roy from Tallneck Tech, and I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about the new line of Nvidia 50 series graphics cards, some trends that I see with them, and talk a little bit about why I can't recommend some of them. A lot of this has to do with the fact that starting with the 40 series, Nvidia started using a new type of power connector called the 12-volt high power rail. For a long time, graphics cards used the 8-pin PCIe connector, right? Where 3 pins were dedicated to voltage and then 3 pins to ground and 2 sense pins. Because they both worked off 12 volts, the maximum wattage that one 8-pin connector could carry was 150 watts, right? It's gonna get a little bit technical, but stay with me. Using Ohm's law, wattage equals current times voltage, we can figure out that at 150 watts for 12 volts, we have 12.5 amps in total of current in the 8-pin PCI Express connector that almost all graphics cards use except for Nvidia. Now, because we have 3 cables that are carrying that 12.5 amps, each cable is carrying about 4.16 amps, right? When we divide 12.5 by 3, we get about 4.16 amps. Both the 8-pin PCI Express connector and the Nvidia 12-volt high power rail use 16 gauge wire, right? So the resistances, the maximum current, the maximum wattage they can handle is the same. When we look at 16 AWG, the size of the cable, the maximum recommended wattage, and this is according to a website called galvanpower.org, which you can look them up if you want, is 18 amps, but for continuous use, it's not recommended to go above 8 amps. If we use 8 amps as our ceiling, if through each wire in the 8-pin connector that was standard for a long time, still the same one that Nvidia uses for their lower end cards, AMD uses in all of their cards, that Intel uses. If you're drawing about 4 amps of current through each wire, you have about like a 50% margin of safety, right? Where even though you have these sense pins, the amperage can fluctuate by about 50%. That's a pretty wide margin. Most electricians can get behind a 50% safety margin. The way that Nvidia's new cable works, I think it was invented by a company called Molex, is that now, instead of having 8 cables, where the voltage is spread across 3 cables, we have 16 cables, where the voltage is spread across 6. They increased the wattage originally from 150 watts per cable, sorry, I have some hair in my mouth, to 450 in the 40 series. The first iteration of this 12-volt high power rail cable handled 450 watts. When that connector was first introduced, there were melting, cables, there were melting connectors onto graphics cards. It was a huge mess. The way that the cable works is that in this 16-pin setup, 6 pins are dedicated to carrying the 12 volts, right, of current. Then we have 6 ground pins, that's the row below it, I believe. And we have 4 sense pins. I think only 2 of them are being used right now. So we have 6 voltage pins, right? If we were using the same standard as the PCIe 8-pin connector, we do the math. We used to have 3 cables carrying 12 volts. Now we have 6 cables. If you want to be safe, we could say that these cables could safely carry about 300 watts, right? We double the wattage, we double the number of cables, 300 watts. Originally, I think that is just about what it carried, was somewhere in the ballpark of 300 watts. But Nvidia upped it to 450 watts to support the 4090. That didn't work out very well, right? Lots of people were having problems with melting connectors, pins that were like melting onto the GPU, and they figured out that some of it was because it wasn't seated correctly, but also the standard itself wasn't running on huge margins of error, right? We're talking about somewhere in the ballpark of like 10%, which, you know, when you're an electrician, it's not super duper safe to work within margins of like smaller or around 10%. That's not great. You want like somewhere in the ballpark of 20 to 25% margin of error for tons of reasons. There's like fluctuations in actual current and, you know, stuff like that. We had 450 watts. Those connectors were burning. Now we have a new generation of Nvidia GPUs where the connector itself hasn't really changed. It stayed exactly the same without really changing the design of the cable, either the gauge of the wire or any of the way that the 12 volt high power rail works. Nvidia added an extra 150 watts, right, to this 12 volt high power rail. So Derbauer, he ran a bunch of numbers, and he also ran a thermal imaging scan over his 5090 Founders Edition. And what he found was that not only was Nvidia running all of these 12 volt cables into one pin on the motherboard, right? Which effectively means separating them does nothing, right? Because the way electricity works, it'll take the path of least resistance. It's always going to take, you know, whatever is closest in terms of the circuit. So not only did they not design the circuit to distribute the current load among the pins, but that the two hottest cables were running at somewhere around like 50 amps. And I'll explain to you in a second why that's so crazy. We'll come back to the numbers, right? We have 600 watts running at 12 volts. So if we want to figure out how much this new cable, which you need if you're going to buy a 5090. So through this one connector, if we divide 600 watts by 12 volts, we get about 50 amps, right? So 50 amps going across 6 cables, that's about 8.33 or 8 1/3 amps going across each individual 16 AWG cable. If we come back to the recommendation for what is a safe current through a 16 AWG cable, right, a 16 gauge cable, 18 amps is okay, but it's not recommended to run 8 amps constantly at or above 90 degrees Celsius. We're running at max load at 8.33 amps, right? That means that at max power, there isn't even a safety margin. We're running above the safety margin, which means that if you run these 5090s at max load for a long enough period of time, it will start to melt, right? And that's what Derbauer was seeing. He was running his 5090 Founders Edition, and the two hottest cables were running at, I think it was something like 50 degrees Celsius, right? Which is around 120-ish degrees Fahrenheit. It's very hot for a cable. And when he measured the temperature at the power supply side, it was running at, something like 120 degrees Celsius, which in Fahrenheit, that's almost 220 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's running so hot that it's literally melting through the plastic. Let's talk about what this means and what I can recommend as someone who is an enthusiast, who loves computers, who builds computers. First off, what does this really mean for the 12 volt high power rail, for NVIDIA GPUs this generation, and for us as informed consumers? How can we buy things that are going to last, right? Because we're spending a lot of money on graphics cards nowadays. Even cheap ones go for like upwards of $300, which is not cheap. You know, $300 is a lot of money. That's like groceries for, 2 months. This problem is nowhere near as bad in the 5080. And the reason that is because the 5080 caps out at 360 watts. When we do the math, 360 watts divided by 12 volts, we get about 30 amps going through the 12 volt connector. That means we have 5 amps per cable. If we divide 5 over 8, we get something like a 38% margin of error, right, or safety margin, which is fine. So I can safely say, if you want to go out, buy a 5080, it'll probably last you a long time, right? And even better, if you want to buy a 5080 that has 3 fans instead of just 2, it'll probably last you even longer, right? Because it'll run a little bit cooler. So the last thing I wanted to look at before I make some recommendations about what graphics cards are good at what price points is these are some benchmarks based off of, I think this is 3D benchmark, looking at the percent gains generation over generation. So comparing the 4090 to the 5090, you're only getting about 2% more in 3D benchmark, right? Which is not great, 2%. It's like if you can get a 4090 for cheap, get a 4090, 2% is nothing. The 4080 versus the 5080 is an 8% leap in 3D benchmark, which again, 8%, like, is that really a generational leap? Not really. I can't compare the 4070 to the 5070 because the 5070 hasn't released yet, so we don't have any data on it. But this generation, Nvidia is really banking on DLSS 4. So we have some generational things that are new. DLSS 4 has this new multi-frame generation tech where it can process up to 3 frames at once, but we haven't really seen enough of it to say whether or not it's completely game-changing. Frame generation is, at the end of the day, a fairly new technology. Even the best frame gen has ghosting and shimmering and things that just look bad, right? And no matter what, they have to say about it, I'm hesitant right up until I see how it works on 50 or 60 titles. So I can't recommend it just based off the new technology. Just going from the benchmarks, there's not much that's super exciting about this new generation of cards. They're just, a little disappointing, to be super honest. That brings me to some recommended cards. I'm gonna break this down to different price points and say what I think is the best card in that price bracket. At around $300, I can recommend the Intel B580 because you're getting 12 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory. That's really good, right? For $300, or sometimes you can even find a B580 for like $250, $270. That is an amazing price for a card. And what's cool about it is Intel has their own frame generation and upscaling technology that's pretty good. It makes running things in 1440p and 4K just look awesome. So if you're on a budget, you want the absolute best card you can get, check out the B580. Just be careful not to pair it with a super old CPU because there have been some issues getting the B580 to work, with, CPUs that are more than something like 6 years old. At around $500, it used to be that around $500 there was a lot of competition where you could get like a cheaper 4070 for around $500, but all the 4070s have disappeared. I don't think this is an accident. I think Nvidia is pulling the supply of 40 series cards ahead of the 50 series launch because they know the 50 series isn't better than the 40 series. When you look at the raw numbers, it's just not. So I can't really recommend an Nvidia card at the moment at around 500 bucks. I think if you are looking for a graphics card at around that price, the 7800 XT is a really good card. It's pretty reasonably priced. You're getting, I believe it's 16 gigabytes of RAM for a super reasonable price. And what you'd have to pay for 16 gigabytes of RAM from Nvidia is almost twice that price, right? You'd have to buy like a 4080 or a 5080, because even the 5070 I don't think has 16 gigabytes of VRAM, which is a crime. You know, it's way too much money to be paying for that little VRAM. And as games demand more and more VRAM, you're basically buying a lemon off the lot. The AMD Radeon 7800 XT, super solid card at 500 bucks. 800. So $800 is kind of where there's a lot more cards competing for your money. You know, so there's a lot of good options at the moment. I'm gonna say if you have $800, you want the absolute best cards you can get, probably look for a 4080. There's a lot of 4080s you can find at around that price point if you look in the right places. Maybe if you're from the United States or Canada, you can check Newegg. Usually has some pretty affordable 4080s. Micro Center also, you can find some reasonably priced 4080s, especially if you can go in store. So the Nvidia RTX 4080, probably at this moment in time, you can find it for around $800. If not, the 9070 XT is coming out in about a month, and it probably will be on par with the 4080 at or around the same price point. So if you can hold out for another month, I'd say the 9070 XT is a good bet. And then at around $1,000, at this point, I'm just gonna say if you have $1,000 to spend on just a graphics card, just get a 5080. I was looking online, you know, about an hour ago. There's a PNY-OC triple fan 5080 on Micro Center going for $999.99. Super great buy. I haven't been able to find it anywhere else, but if you can get that specific card, it's probably worth it. And then top of the line. So it used to be that if you wanted a top of the line card, you could choose between AMD and Nvidia. That's gone. So I'm gonna preface this by saying, if you are buying a 5090, do not buy the Founders Edition, because the Founders Edition cards are just built poorly. I'm gonna put an asterisk on this and say, only buy it if you can afford it, and don't expect it to last forever, because this current 5090 is basically playing with fire. Like, it's at the literal current and thermal limit of what a 16 gauge cable can handle. So buy it if money is no object for you. If you just need the latest and greatest and it doesn't matter to you, definitely go for that Asus ROG 5090 and not the Founders Edition 5090, because those are kind of, you know, ticking time bombs. And if you need any proof, I will have Derbauer's video linked in the description down below. I'm gonna have links to all of these graphics cards and maybe some simple builds for each one. Some of these will be affiliate links, so if you choose to build a PC using any of those links, I do get a slight kickback. Not that it's gonna charge you anything extra. And if you're interested in building a PC or want any help building one, my website is also linked down in the description. So thank you so much for watching this video. Catch you guys next time. Bye.